Hey guys, and welcome to this paint tutorial of Ned Stark, Eddard Stark, from the famous Game of Thrones series. This is a beautiful model created by Knight Models and was included in the base game as an extra, as a pre-order extra. I can't wait to start painting this because this is such a famous pose from the very first episode. Look at him leaning on his great sword just before he executes the deserter. This is highly detailed. This is a very famous pose of him. Everybody knows him. I primed the model with a Mechanica Standard Grey and then highlighted it with a lighter grey spray just to accentuate the highlights on this model, which is great if you want to see where the light falls. Great when using contrast paints, for example. Just easy to spot the tiny details where the light falls on the top of his gloves, on the top of his head, etc. So let's start painting some base colors. So for his face, I start off with a base mix of Buckman Glow and Acadian Flesh Tone. Ned Stark has a very pale face, and I didn't want to start off too dark. Best to use a very thin coat because you do not want to lose any of the details in this model. For the under armor and part of his arms, I mixed a Castellan green with Abaddon black. And again, you want to be adding some thin layers. And maybe go over it twice if you haven't reached a nice coverage. Now for the body armor, I mixed an equal part of Rhinox hide and Doomble brown, which creates a nice reddish, leathery color. So for the cloak, we're going to use a Black Templar contrast paint. I've added some shading during the priming phase, so you're going to get a nice differentiation in color and highlights. Make sure to start from the top, as the shades, the contrast paints are going to flow down, and I want those highlights to appear nicely and no concentration of paint in the bottom. So let's spread it around and make sure we get a nice coverage. This is probably going to take a second coat. Let's continue with his hair. And for that, I'm going to use some Steel Legion Drab, as that is a bit of a reddish blonde guy. But you should start off quite light. His hair is darker than this, but I'm going to shade it later on and then highlight it back up. So I forgot the gloves in the previous stage. The gloves have the same base color as the body armor. They're also made of the same leather. So use the Doomble brown and Rhinox hide mix that we made before. And also the belt. And same goes for his boots. I want them to stand out and be quite bright. So I gave him the same leathery base coat. So next thing we're going to paint is the giant sword. I'm going to give it a base color of lead belcher. Now I want the pants over here to be slightly darker than the rest, so I use pure Rhinox hide as a base color, which we're going to darken even furthermore using some shades. Right now, before I continue to do the top of the cloak, which is, I think it's a badger, isn't it? I'm going to relayer the Black Templar of the cape, make it less transparent. So just add an extra layer to darken it down a bit. While still keeping some transparency, because we want that different colors in there. So to finish off the cloak, we have this, is it a badger, I think, to paint. I'm going to base color it in some Karak stone and then add some dark parts on top of that. Make sure to use a very thin layer because it has some tiny details and you don't want to clog your paint in those recesses. So better to go over it twice than to add too much at once. So the last part of the base coat will be his color, just coming from under his base armor. And for that I'm going to mix some Bugman Glow with Rhinox hide to create a slightly dark pinkish color. Great, so well that's it for the base coats. On to the highlight stage. We're going to be using some Agrax Earth shade for all the leathery parts. I'm going to use it in quite a heavy form, so a pure Agrax Earth shade for these. Make sure to touch all the leather. And let it get into those recesses to create some nice shading. So that goes for the gloves, the belt, the armor, and the boots. And also the trousers, you can take that with this part of the shading as well. So right now I'm going to use a thinned down Agrax Earth shades, basically 1:1 ratio with some Lamia medium to shade the hair. Let's use some Athonian camo shade for the green parts of his armor, so basically the, what do you call that, a skirt. we go. And some non-oil for the sword. For the face, we're going to use some thinned down Reichland Flesh Shade. Create those nice shades on his forehead. So next thing we're going to do is paint the eyes, which is a pain in the ass for most painters, but let's give it a go. Make sure you have a very, very fine detail brush and use as little paint as possible. Now there is something to say for doing the eyes before you do all the highlighting, to do the even before the shade, because you have a way of correcting your mistakes with the base color. Now, I don't know if you can see it because it's very, very tiny, but I went a little bit too far with the whites on my model. I accidentally touched a little bit too much to the side, but no worries here because we can clean this up with your base color. Now before I do that, I first want to add a pupil to the eye. I'm going to use a Batten Black. We just need a tiny tip in the center of the eye. And the reason I'm doing it now is that when you accidentally touch another part of the eye you're not supposed to touch, you can cover it up with the base color. Now this part is for most painters the most difficult part. Now to clean up your mistakes, just use your base color and just bring it back to where it's supposed to be, and you can give him the exact expression you like. I'm not a professional painter, but this is a technique I use a lot to create the faces that I want without having the pressure of doing it exactly right all at the first try. And for me, this is what painting is supposed to be. It's supposed to give you satisfaction. Yeah, look at that. So after carefully studying some pictures, I decided to go for a little more brownish look on the cape, and for that I'm going to use a sponge and just stipple some paint on there to get this furry look, a bit of a uneven surface, which is quite difficult on flat surfaces, but we're going to try and create the illusion. For that I mixed some Rhinox hide with Caliban green to get a nice dark greenish brown. I'm going to put that on this sponge and just dab it around a little bit. As with dry brushing, you don't want too much on it. You want a little bit of color variation on this cloak. A bit of a darker look, which we're going to highlight further on. It's okay if in the recesses you're not reaching all of it, because you want it to be darker. So in this way we're creating sort of a natural shading. Try and hit the top part just below the badger. And of course we can tidy up using a brush, because we're not going to be able to reach these small narrow parts. Yeah, and this is looking quite nicely. Also, when in previous stages you want to, when you use oils or shades or whatever, you get this like this shiny effect. You don't want that. At least I don't want this on my models. So adding an extra layer, either using a dry brush or a sponge, is a great way of covering up those shiny parts. Now, as for the badger, I used a reference image I found on the web of Ned Stark, a close-up of Ned Stark with this badger on his shoulder. And I'm going to try and copy these details as best as we can. I'm using a fine detail brush. I'm going to keep the nose white. There is a big large stripe on the top, and what we're using for this is some Black Legion contrast paint. I like the contrast paint because we want the white hairs to shine through. You can thin it down if you like. Now for the badger, we've used a light undercoat. I'm now using a contrast paint, Black Legion, to completely cover the badger. Is it a badger? I'm still having doubts. It looks like a badger. Anyway, we're covering the entirety of the badger so that the lighter paint is shining through, and we get that nice, a bit of dirty white. Now for our highlight stages, when we're going to continue highlighting the badger on his shoulder, and as we can see in his reference pic, he has a white nose. The tip will be black. We're going to do that in the end. I'm using some sharp T-bone for that because I don't want it to be too bright at first. Right. Now there is some black line on his back, so I'm going to try and hit the two strains beside it. You don't want even lines when doing fur. You want it to be uneven, natural looking. So what you could try and do is create some lines. Now I want some transition between the white and the black legion, the blacker areas. So I'm adding some brown to my sharp T-bone, and I used Fondia brown, and I brightened it up just a little bit with some Ushabti. You just want to carefully pick out some hairs, part of the fur, to create some color differences. Now to blend all this together, I'm using some thinned down nuln oil to create a nice smooth transition between those colors and an overall darker look. Right now we're going to do some edge highlighting with palette witch flesh. Just to pick out some of the small details. I would say to make it more look alive, but let's face it, he's dead. Next I'm going to be highlighting his face, and for that I'm going to use some Cadian flesh tone. Add that to all the raised areas. His jawline is covered in beard. Now Ned Stark, he has quite a pale face. So we're going to be highlighting it even further. And for the final highlight stage, I'm going to use some pure Kislev flesh. Just on the very edges. And I decided to add some palette witch flesh to the Kislev flesh to even highlight him a little bit more, because I want that pale look on his face. Now we're going to be highlighting his hair next, and for that I'm using some Baylor brown, because it's like a reddish, yellowish, nice blonde look. I'm going to pick out the strands of hair. Next I'm doing some edge highlighting on the body armor, gloves, boots and belt with Tuskor fur. I used some Gorthor brown to edge highlight the pants. For his, well, is it a skirt? I'm still unsure. I highlighted the little square boxes with a mix of Caliban green and warpstone glow. Make sure not to touch the recesses, because you want to have the difference between the dark and the lighter areas to create an illusion of depth. Next, you give it a touch of pure warpstone glow in the center of the square boxes, just to give it the final highlight. Now if you want, you can dirty up the cloak at the bottom, just to make it look like it's been seeing some rough weather, dirty roads, whatever. I use a dry brush for this, and I just touched it here and there to create this dirty look at the bottom of the cloak. You can use some brown, basically any brown will do, Gorthor brown or a dried bark. A bit of a darker brown color looks very nice. It's supposed to look dusty and filthy. I used Hashwood copper to touched the very ends of the swords. And I later on highlighted it with some canoptic alloy. The edges of the sword I highlighted with rune fang steel. And lastly, I used some Seraphim sepia to blend all the leathery colors together and give it a nice shiny look. And there we have him, Lord Eddard Stark.